she wasn't the typical scam artist. There were no ski masks, no weapons, no shady deals in alleyways. Yet Elizabeth Holmes would go on to orchestrate one of the most deceptive corporate crimes in modern history, a medical fraud that would risk the lives of thousands and cost investors billions. But before the scandal, there was a dream born not in a lab, but in the mind of a teenage girl obsessed with changing the world. Born in 1984, Elizabeth and Holmes grew up in Washington, D.C., into a family with political and business ties. Her father worked for government agencies like USAID, while her mother was a congressional committee staffer. From a young age, Elizabeth was different, reserved, fiercely intelligent, and relentlessly ambitious. By the time she reached her teens, she was devouring books on invention, empires, and disruption. But it was one man who captured her imagination like no other: Steve Jobs. The late Apple co-founder wasn't just a tech icon, he was her idol. Holmes mimicked his every move, from his minimalist clothing style to his infamous reality distortion field. She wanted to be him, but not in tech, in healthcare. Holmes enrolled in Stanford University at just 18, studying chemical engineering. Her professors noted her intensity, her drive, her near-fanatical vision of revolutionizing medicine. She wasn't interested in small change. She wanted to build a device that could diagnose dozens of diseases using a single drop of blood, a revolutionary idea that could eliminate the need for painful vials, long waits, and traditional lab work. It was bold, daring, audacious, and scientifically nearly impossible. By her sophomore year, Holmes couldn't wait any longer. In 2003, at just 19 years old, she dropped out of Stanford and launched her own company, Theranos. With the help of her mentor, Channing Robertson, a respected Stanford professor, she began pitching investors, spinning a story so compelling, so futuristic, that few asked hard questions. Theranos was short for therapy and diagnosis. It was marketed as the next Apple of healthcare, led by a young woman in a black turtleneck with icy blue eyes and a deep, manufactured voice that gave her an air of authority. She wasn't just a Stanford dropout. She was dubbed the female Steve Jobs, and investors were captivated. Her charisma was unmatched, her vision irresistible, her device mysteriously secretive, but no one seemed to mind. Holmes understood one thing perfectly. In Silicon Valley, narrative is everything. With a well-crafted pitch deck and just enough tech jargon, she sold a dream of painless blood testing that could save lives and disrupt a $70 billion industry. Never mind that the technology hadn't been proven. Never mind that respected scientists were skeptical. Holmes controlled the image. She controlled the room. She controlled the story. And before long, she would control hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, board members from the highest echelons of government, and partnerships with giants like Walgreens. It was the perfect con, disguised not in secrecy, but in brilliance. By the time Theranos reached its $9 billion valuation, Elizabeth Holmes was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. She was celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Her face plastered beside headlines like "This CEO is out for blood." But while the media hailed her as a visionary, inside Theranos, the cracks were already forming. Tests were being manipulated. Machines were malfunctioning. Employees were terrified to speak out. The truth was bleeding through. Blood, lies, and billionaires. Discover how Theranos fooled some of the world's smartest investors with a product that never worked, and why no one dared to question Elizabeth Holmes until it was too late. Theranos promised to revolutionize healthcare. A single drop of blood, that's all it would take to test for cancer, diabetes, and hundreds of other conditions. It sounded like magic because it was. At the core of this biotech fraud was a device that never worked. Yet Holmes convinced some of the most powerful investors in the world to pour in millions. No clinical proof, no peer-reviewed studies, just charm, secrecy, and a seductive story. In Holmes' mind, Silicon Valley wasn't just a place, it was a philosophy. Fake it till you make it. Apple did it. Facebook did it. Why not Theranos? Elizabeth Holmes believed in what she was building. Or, at least, she believed it would eventually work. So if you had to blur a few lines, stage a few demos, what did it matter? The vision was too important. In her eyes, the end justified the means. Lives would be saved once the science caught up to the ambition. Until then, she just needed money and belief. Theranos officially launched in 2003, but its so-called revolutionary device wouldn't be seen by the public for over a decade. Inside the company, the device was codenamed Edison. It was designed to run hundreds of blood tests using just a few drops from a finger prick. But there was one massive problem. It didn't work. It never did. Instead of slowing down, Holmes doubled down. She staged demos using pre-tested samples. She showed investors manipulated results. She buried questions beneath NDAs and intimidation. No scientific board, no transparency, just carefully curated performances and smoke. Yet despite the red flags, the money rolled in. Holmes was a master of perception. She understood how to shape reality. She didn't target scientists. She targeted powerful men with no medical background, people like Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State, General James Mattis, future U.S. Secretary of Defense, Rupert Murdoch, media mogul, George Shultz, former Secretary of State. These weren't just board members. They were shields. Their names gave Theranos legitimacy. Their networks open vaults. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes was hailed as the next Steve Jobs, and Walgreens signed a deal to put Theranos devices in hundreds of stores across America. Yet behind the curtain, the device still failed basic tests. Technicians were instructed to use third-party lab equipment like Siemens analyzers, while telling investors it was Theranos tech. A Silicon Valley investor scam was in full swing, and no one dared speak up. As the Theranos empire expanded, so did the lies. Employees were silenced. Scientists were fired. Those who questioned the technology were branded disloyal, or worse, threats. Still, Holmes remained untouchable. She had the money. She had the press. She had the myth. But inside the lab, a few voices refused to stay quiet. And what they were about to reveal would ignite the biggest biotech fraud scandal in U.S. history. It wasn't just the machine that was fake. It was the data, the results, the hope. Theranos didn't just sell a product, it sold an illusion. A fantasy built on secrecy and seduction. From the outside, it looked like the future of medicine. But inside, it was a carefully staged performance of broken promises and manipulated truths. The lab, the sacred ground where medical breakthroughs are born, became a theater of lies. Employees were ordered to rerun failed tests until the results looked acceptable. Software was reprogrammed to make numbers appear closer to traditional lab results. And when that didn't work, they simply used other companies' machines, silently running blood tests on commercial analyzers while pretending it came from Theranos Edison device. This was no longer hopeful innovation. It was fake medical tech, sold with the confidence of a prophet and the funding of a king. But even the greatest illusions can't survive scrutiny. And as the company grew, so did the doubts. In the shadows of the Theranos empire, brave employees started to notice the cracks. Some were scientists, some were engineers. They saw the errors, the cover-ups, the complete disregard for scientific protocol. They spoke up, and they were punished. Some were isolated. Others were watched. Many were forced to sign aggressive NDAs. And a few, those who asked too many questions, were terminated on the spot. Theranos had built more than a company. It had built a culture of fear. One employee, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Shultz, dared to confront the fraud. But even he faced threats, legal action, and family pressure to stay silent. Meanwhile, Holmes doubled down on her story. With every public appearance, she spun the same hypnotic vision of painless, fast, life-saving blood testing. She wowed audiences. She dazzled investors. And she warned her staff. Leaking information would not be tolerated. This was startup deception at its most dangerous, where the quest for disruption crossed into delusion. Where truth wasn't buried, it was engineered out of existence. Behind her perfectly curated image, behind the wide eyes and low voice, Holmes had become something more than a CEO. She was the guardian of the illusion, and she would do anything to protect it. But illusions fade, and a few insiders were about to break the silence, no matter the cost. In business, partnerships are built on trust. But when one side is hiding a lie, the cost of that trust can be catastrophic. In 2010, Theranos began courting one of the most powerful retail chains in the United States, Walgreens. The pitch was perfect: futuristic blood testing in local drugstores. Fast, affordable, no needles. It was a vision straight out of science fiction, and Walgreens wanted in. Behind closed doors, a secret deal was signed, one worth over $100 million in payments and investments. Theranos would set up wellness centers in hundreds of Walgreens stores, where customers could get a finger prick and walk out with a near-instant diagnosis. It was a landmark moment. With this partnership, Theranos would finally go public, not with an IPO, but with actual patient tests. And that's when the real danger began, because what Walgreens didn't know was that the technology still didn't work. Inside Theranos labs, employees were scrambling. The Edison devices were unreliable, producing wildly inconsistent results. Tests had to be rerun multiple times. Some were quietly sent to conventional labs. Others were outright fabricated. Instead of fixing the science, Holmes focused on scaling the dream. To Walgreens, she offered limited demonstrations, cherry-picked data, and promises of progress. And when Walgreens executives asked tough questions, they were met with deflections, jargon, or legal red tape. No peer-reviewed studies, no open audits, no real transparency. Just a corporate sleight of hand that allowed a failing product to be placed into real stores, testing real patients. And the silence didn't stop with Walgreens. Theranos secured a $350 million round of funding soon after, propelling its valuation to over $9 billion. Investors were dazzled by the Walgreens deal. They saw it as proof of validation. What they didn't realize was that they were investing not in innovation, but in illusion. Meanwhile, inside the Theranos labs, staff were under increasing pressure to keep up appearances. They knew the truth. The machines never worked, and each test run risked not just investor money, but human lives. But no one on the outside knew that yet. And as the company continued to raise money and open testing centers, one journalist was quietly gathering sources for an article that would change everything. In the glossy pages of Forbes and Fortune, she was everywhere. Elizabeth Holmes, blonde, intense, and dressed in her signature black turtleneck, was no longer just a founder. She had become a myth. By 2014, Theranos had reached a $9 billion valuation. Its technology remained hidden from scrutiny, but Holmes was front and center, gracing magazine covers, speaking at TED Talks, and being hailed as the female Steve Jobs. She spoke in soundbites crafted for admiration. Phrases like, "a world where no one has to say goodbye too soon," made headlines. Her voice, oddly deep and deliberate, became iconic. And her image, carefully styled and studied, captivated Silicon Valley. Investors followed the hype, not the hardware. With each round of funding, Theranos moved further from scientific validation and closer to startup stardom. It became a unicorn not because of breakthrough results, but because of belief. And Holmes understood exactly how to sell that belief. She surrounded herself with powerful men who lacked the expertise to challenge her claims. Former statesmen, military generals, and retail executives, all drawn into the cult of her conviction. They didn't need proof. They had faith. Behind the scenes, employees knew the truth was darker. The Edison device remained unreliable. Patients were being misdiagnosed, and every glowing feature in the press pushed the company further into a corner where failure was not an option. But the cracks were forming, and a few inside the company had stopped believing in the story. As the outside world celebrated her as the richest self-made woman in America, the inside of Theranos was fraying under the weight of its own lies. The illusion couldn't last forever. The machine beeped. Another test failed. Inside Theranos, hope was being replaced by fear. Former believers had become silent observers, watching the truth break through the surface like light under a frozen lake. And in 2015, that ice began to crack. The whispers started with internal doubts. Lab technicians questioned the integrity of the results. Engineers raised concerns about patient safety, and some could no longer sleep at night, knowing people were getting dangerously inaccurate diagnoses. Among them were Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, young, idealistic employees who once saw Theranos as the future. Now, they saw it for what it was, a company trading in fiction wrapped in medical promises it couldn't keep. They tried to raise concerns through the proper channels, HR, senior management, even the board. But inside Theranos, there was no room for honesty, only compliance. That's when one of them made a phone call to John Carreyrou, a seasoned investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Carreyrou had heard rumors. Too much secrecy, too few published studies. Theranos didn't operate like a biotech company. It operated like a black box. Now, he had sources, and they were scared. They spoke in code. They met in parking lots. They feared lawsuits, surveillance, even retaliation. But the truth was too urgent to ignore. Carreyrou spent months piecing together the puzzle. He spoke to former employees, reviewed internal documents, tracked regulatory reports. And what he found was staggering. A blood testing company valued at $9 billion was using third-party machines to run most of its tests. Its proprietary tech didn't work. And worst of all, it was already being used on real patients. The resulting article, published in October 2015, didn't just challenge Theranos. It shattered the illusion. The headlines read like a thriller. Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. Holmes denied it all. She called the article false. She went on TV to defend the company with fire in her eyes. But the damage was done. And for the first time, the public began to see Theranos not as a miracle, but as a mirage. The headlines spread like wildfire. The girl who once promised to change healthcare was now the face of a massive medical fraud scandal. As the Wall Street Journal's revelations took root, regulators came knocking. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, launched an investigation into Theranos lab practices, and what they found was worse than anyone expected. Improper procedures, inaccurate results, unqualified lab staff, all hidden behind layers of NDAs and legal threats. In January 2016, CMS issued a devastating report that exposed systemic violations. Holmes tried to spin it, calling the problems fixable, but the walls were closing in. One by one, Theranos partners pulled out. Walgreens severed ties. Major investors distanced themselves. The once adored unicorn was now toxic. The media turned. The same outlets that had once called her a genius were now questioning everything. Her background, her tech, her intentions. But the worst was yet to come. In 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, dropped the hammer. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were formally charged with massive fraud. She had misled investors, lied about technology, falsely claimed Theranos machines were used by the U.S. Department of Defense in war zones. It wasn't just business misconduct. It was criminal deception at the highest level. To avoid a lengthy legal battle, Holmes settled. She paid a $500,000 fine, returned 18.9 million shares, and, most significantly, was banned from serving as an officer or director of any public company for 10 years. Theranos was unraveling fast. Employees were laid off. The company's labs were shut down, and what remained was a shell, emptied of hope, stripped of value. But there was still one question echoing in boardrooms, hospitals, and courtrooms. If the investors were fooled, if the regulators were blind, what about the patients? The story of Theranos had moved beyond boardrooms and Silicon Valley hype. It was now about real people, real lives disrupted by false promises. Patients had entrusted their health to Elizabeth Holmes' revolutionary vision, a vision that now revealed itself as a dangerous lie. Fake lab results weren't just a corporate scandal. They posed a serious health risk. Women received incorrect pregnancy results. Patients were misdiagnosed with serious illnesses or falsely reassured they were healthy. Doctors were blindsided, making critical medical decisions based on unreliable data. Whistleblowers inside Theranos had warned of the risks, but Holmes and her inner circle silenced dissent with intimidation and legal threats. The company culture was one of secrecy and fear, designed to protect the illusion at all costs. Lawsuits soon flooded in. Families sought justice for the harm caused by Theranos' flawed tests. Regulators ramped up investigations into whether the company's actions amounted to criminal negligence. The media exposed the harsh human toll behind the headlines: betrayal, shattered trust, and a health tech industry shaken to its core. Theranos was no longer just a failed startup. It was a biotech scam that jeopardized countless lives. The ripple effect stretched far beyond Silicon Valley. Investors, once eager to fund the next big thing in medical innovation, began demanding transparency and accountability. The public's faith in groundbreaking health technology was deeply fractured. Amid the chaos, Elizabeth Holmes remained a controversial figure, vilified by some, defended by others. Her carefully crafted persona, the black turtleneck, the female Steve Jobs mystique, was crumbling under the weight of truth. The once celebrated visionary was now facing mounting legal battles and public condemnation. But the final chapter was about to begin. The nation would soon witness the courtroom drama that would decide Elizabeth Holmes' fate. Would justice prevail, or would the cult of deception endure? The courtroom was packed, the nation riveted. Elizabeth Holmes, once Silicon Valley's golden girl, now stood accused in a high-stakes federal fraud case. The trial was more than legal drama. It was a public reckoning. Day after day, the world watched as prosecutors meticulously laid out their case. They painted a picture of deliberate deception, of false promises spun to lure investors and partners into a multi-billion-dollar Theranos scam. Witnesses testified, former employees, whistleblowers, investors betrayed by glossy pitches and manipulated data. Emails, internal documents, and expert testimony revealed a labyrinth of lies that stretched across the company's entire operation. Holmes took the stand. Her defense: ambition, mistakes, and a vision misunderstood. She denied knowingly deceiving anyone, insisting she truly believed in Theranos' potential. The courtroom drama gripped media and public alike. For some, Holmes was a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. For others, a victim of Silicon Valley's ruthless culture. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution argued that this was not just a startup failure. It was a calculated fraud that endangered lives and stole billions. After weeks of intense testimony, closing arguments were made. The jury would decide whether Elizabeth Holmes was a brilliant innovator or a master deceiver. As the jury deliberated, the country waited with bated breath. Would justice serve truth? Or would Elizabeth Holmes' carefully crafted myth endure? The verdict was in. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, a dramatic end to one of the most sensational corporate scandals in history. Her sentencing marked the fall of a titan once hailed as Silicon Valley's youngest female billionaire. Prison time was inevitable, an unambiguous message that deception in healthcare innovation would not be tolerated. But the story didn't end with Holmes behind bars. Theranos, once valued at $9 billion, dissolved into dust. Investors lost hundreds of millions, their faith shattered. The biotech world faced an identity crisis. How could such a monumental fraud slip through the cracks of due diligence and regulatory oversight? Silicon Valley took a hard look at itself. The cult of personality, the rush to back charismatic founders, and the hunger for disruptive innovation at any cost came under fierce scrutiny. Regulators tightened controls. Investors became more cautious. The scandal forced a reckoning, balancing ambition with accountability. For the countless patients misled by faulty tests, the damage was real and lasting. Trust in medical startups eroded, making the road to innovation longer and harder. Elizabeth Holmes' saga became a cautionary tale, one of unchecked ambition, the power of illusion, and the devastating cost of lies. Her story remains etched in history as the biggest startup scam ever, a stark warning to innovators and investors alike. As the dust settled, one question lingered. Could the world of biotech ever fully recover from the shadow of Theranos? This concludes the series on Elizabeth Holmes, a complex tale of dreams, deception, and downfall.
If the story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Smash that notification bell, because if you don't stay informed, you just might become the next story we tell.